Last week, The Guardian published an essay by the Pakistani-born writer Mohsin Hamid entitled Breaking the Binary, in which he set the binary world of the machine, sorting the zeros from the ones, against the imaginative realm of literature, where boundaries can be transgressed and constructs of race, perception, and self are destabilized and constantly changing. He writes of an experiment conducted by an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, which simulated cooperation and competition by machines over many generations. The computer models were set to play a game together, and a pattern evolved. He writes, a particular type of machine became dominant, one that recognized and favored copies of itself. Enormous prosperity ensued, built on ever-growing levels of cooperation. But eventually, the minute differences that naturally occurred in the copying process, as they do in organisms when genes are passed on, became intolerable, and war among the machines resulted in near complete devastation and a new beginning, after which the cycle repeated over and over. Like Hamsin, one is struck by this recurring cycle that moves from cooperation to the tendency of differences to become intolerable. Society moves in waves, from one societal epoch to the next. A period of extended peacetime and prosperity in the West is not only profoundly threatened, but seems to be at the edge of a precipitous abyss. Russia's war in Ukraine, which has receded from the headlines, is causing suffering and death to its own citizens and starvation in the global South, where countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, and others are dependent on the breadbasket of Europe. It seems inconceivable in the 21st century to be considering once again the threat of nuclear war. And in the last weeks, we can no longer deny the crisis of a climate emergency which demands radical action. The rise in the cost of living, which will increase further in the coming months, is cracking open more widely the massive fissures between rich and poor. All these things are unmitigated dangers to ourselves and more particularly the generations to come. The belief in a progressive world that moves us onwards and upwards in Jewish terms towards the ideal of a messianic age has slowly been eroded and replaced instead with an almost apocalyptic vision that the end of the world is nigh. For some time, I have been reflecting on that major theological premise on which liberal Judaism is based, the belief in the coming of the Messianic age, and wondering what to do with it. Progressive Judaism, from an early stage in its history, repudiated the idea of a personal Messiah, the royal descendant of David, who would lead the Jewish people from exile back to the Promised Land, oversee the rebuilding of the temple and the reinstitution of the sacrificial cult, and preside over a period of peace and prosperity. Instead, liberal Jews replaced the idea of an individual Messiah with the generic vision of a messianic age, applicable not only to the Jewish people, but to all humanity. Actually, the vision of universal redemption goes back to the Bible, to Isaiah, who hopes for God's redeeming hand to rescue all the nations, not just Israel. Maimonides speaks of a time when wisdom will increase and war will cease, quoting the verse from Isaiah, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war any more. At that time, says Maimonides, there will be no famines, no wars, no envy, and no competition, for goodness will be pervasive. The Pittsburgh Platform, a document produced in 1885 by the Reform Jewish leadership in the United States, framed Jewish nationhood differently. Jews no longer saw themselves as a nation, said its authors, but as a religious community. The return to Palestine, sacrificial worship, and the priesthood would no longer play a part in liberal Judaism. We recognize, they said, in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect, the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. And I assume they included women in that last phrase. Yet, even in Talmudic times, as early as then, there was an underlying sense that the coming of the Messiah might almost be inconceivable, or perhaps even dangerous to imagine. Let the Messiah come, but not yet, is the implicit message of a whole series of statements setting out highly improbable conditions before he can come. In a famous statement in Sanhedrin, Ullah, one of the rabbis, says, "Let the Messiah come, but after my death, so that I will not see him, as I fear that suffering precede his coming." And an old Jewish story tells of a Russian Jew who was paid a ruble a month by the community council to stand at the outskirts of town so that he could be the first person to greet the Messiah upon his arrival. When a friend said to him, "But the pay is so low," the man replied, "True, but the job is permanent." Despite this, the hope of redemption persisted. Even in our own Siddur, the first blessing of the daily tefillah, known as the Avot, the patriarchs and matriarchs, asks God to bring redemption to our children's children, while the seventh blessing in the daily prayer, not on Shabbat, requests God to redeem us speedily for your name's sake. And of course, the Aleinu prayer at the end of the service expresses the hope that false gods will vanish from our hearts and that God will help us to perfect the world by bringing it under God's unchallenged rule. The question that perplexes me constantly as a liberal Jew is how to reframe that belief in a messianic age, and how to hold on to the urgency of those prayers that keep insisting on us praying for prosperity, for peace, for inner tranquility of spirit, when the world seems so overwhelming, so frightening, and so hopeless. 2 days ago, I received a message from someone at Westminster City Council asking whether we had any clothes for 17 homeless men and 7 homeless women who had lost all their belongings in a fire in a hostel in Westminster. I sent out an email to some of the volunteers of our drop-in who oversee the clothes for our own guests, and immediately a small team offered to come in first thing this morning to fill some bags, which will go to the people who have lost everything they own. The volunteers will tell you that they would want others to do the same for them were they in a similar situation. But it is these small deeds of loving kindness and the school uniform that many of you brought here today and in preceding weeks for the children of our guests at the drop-in, things that happen without a second thought for your own arrangements that are so important in helping to improve the lives of others. We cannot perfect the world, but we can take small steps and bring others with us. Putting ourselves in the shoes of others who are not like ourselves is what breaks down the boundaries of tribalism and nationalism. To do that, says Mohsin Hamid, allows us to venture into the fear of the other. It acknowledges what is not like ourselves. It seeks to allow us to experience the losses bring with less sadness, but sadness made bearable by hope. The grand theological architecture of a messianic age may be far away in the distance, but our hope that things can be a tiny bit better cannot afford to be so. Tikva, the Hebrew word for hope, comes from the root kava, to wait for or to look eagerly for. But it also means to collect or to gather together, like the mikveh gathering of waters. Hope arises from our coming together as a community to perform deeds of loving kindness for each other and for those whose life experience is different from our own. Let us renew our strength through our hope and trust in the goodness of humankind, inspired by the mysterious presence of something greater than ourselves. Amen.